Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. Thanks for tuning in. This is an educational channel. We check out great findings, discoveries, and things that you probably never heard of before. But if you did, they could make a very big impact on your life. And we've been decoding the New Testament of the Bible for the last few months. Here, this is day 175, I believe. And we've been focusing a lot on the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament. A growing body of scholarship is out there now that all say in one way or another that the New Testament was written by the Romans, the Caesars, as a psychological operation, generally in order to mellow out the Jews. An operation against the Jews to tame them or domesticate them, or just make them less militant, because ever since the Romans came to Judea or conquered Judea in 63 BC, they were subject to constant revolts, uprisings, revolutions, and wars from the Jews, who had a separatist religion that they believed they were the chosen people, and they had a lot of quirky and idiosyncratic rituals that were all a pain for the Romans to monitor, to manage in their empire. The Jews were the highest maintenance of any of the people that lived under the Roman Empire, and this kind of culminated in the Jewish War from 66 to 73 AD, where three Jewish zealots, actually really candidates for Messiah, because the Jews from the Old Testament were waiting for a Messiah. And the Messiah they were waiting for was the military commander who was going to help them overthrow the Romans. And they did just that in 66 AD briefly. Simon, John, and Eleazar and other zealots kicked out the Herod puppet kings of Rome and sent them packing out of Jerusalem, and requiring Emperor Nero to send in General Vespasian. And that was in 66 AD. Eventually, Vespasian became the new emperor in 69 AD, and he left the generalship to his son Titus. And then his son Titus eventually destroyed utterly Jerusalem and tracked the rest of the Jews down all the way to Masada, where there was allegedly a massive suicide of Jewish zealots, as opposed to surrendering to Rome. And that was about it in 73 AD. Both Vespasian and Titus were actually wounded in the war, and I think after it all ended, they decided to carry out this psychological operation, which I believe was hatched much, much earlier, but they finally pulled the trigger on it here in the 70s AD. And they wrote a story of a different kind of Jewish Messiah. Not one who wanted to destroy and kick out the Romans, but instead one who was a Prince of Peace, and who believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, walking an extra mile with the Roman soldier's pack, and turning the other cheek to oppression, believing that the Roman slave owner had the greatest faith in all of Israel, and at the same time going outside the Jewish temple and turning over the money changers who were trying to turn the Roman money that had graven images on it into kosher money to bring inside the temple, and messing with the commerce of the Jews who were there selling small animals for the sacrifice. So in other words, the Romans wrote about a Jewish Messiah who was utterly deferential to the Romans, but who was a disruptor to the Jewish way of life, the rituals that were so difficult and high maintenance for the Romans to look after. But I think one of the main motives, now the Emperor Vespasian, Emperor Titus, and Titus's brother Domitian were known as the Flavian dynasty of Caesars from 69 until 96 AD. And so I think another motive for the Romans, especially for Titus, was that the Jews kind of made an impression on him with them refusing, even after being conquered, refusing to refer to Titus as God, and choosing to be killed instead of acknowledging Titus as a god. And I think Titus wanted to write this also so that the Jews would actually worship him as a god, even though they didn't know that they were doing this. So they wrote this Gospel of Mark, and eventually they wrote up Matthew, and they wrote up Luke, and with just slight changes. But I think Luke is the one that was really carefully crafted by the Romans. And they also wrote a history of this war against the Jews called Jewish War. It was written under the name of Josephus, or Flavius Josephus, who may or may not have existed, but he's known as one of the great historians of antiquity, and certainly the most important historian of antiquity. Christians know his name because he's the only author not from the New Testament to corroborate the existence of Jesus in the first century. But Josephus was, even by his own account, a family member by adoption of the Flavians, of the Roman Caesars. He lived at Caesar's palace in a townhouse. He was one of the court historians for the Flavians. And he was actually adopted by General Vespasian because he had made a prediction that came true about Vespasian one day becoming emperor. That is a tall tale that's very difficult to accept, because that's not really what the Romans would have done. They would have dragged Josephus, who was originally one of the Jewish military commanders before he surrendered to Vespasian and defected to the Romans. They would have dragged him through the avenue there, Capitoline, in Rome, and they would have humiliated him and ultimately executed him. But instead, they pardoned Josephus and brought him to Rome and adopted him as a member of their family. made him the court historian. But whoever Josephus was, he wrote a 7-volume War of the Jews, which, if you examine it carefully, you will see manifold parallels with especially the Gospel of Luke. Joseph Atwill looks at over 40 separate events that now Vespasian and Titus are basically the protagonists of War of the Jews because they are the military commanders in this war, especially Titus. And Atwill examines Titus's 3-year-long military campaign and Jesus' 3-year-long ministry in Judea. Every place that Titus goes, Jesus also goes, in the same order, and each place that they go, they encounter a parallel event. Not the same event, but one that is typologically similar or congruent. And each one of the events is set off by exactly 40 years. And we're talking about not just a couple of events, we're talking about over 40 events. So the ministry of Jesus is based on, at least in the book of Luke, it is based on the military campaign of Titus, as written up in Josephus's War of the Jews. The inevitable conclusion is that whoever wrote War of the Jews also wrote the Gospels. So that's why you can say that the Flavians wrote the Gospels, or at least the book of Luke. And then comes 2024, and a new book written by Michael Menescotts called Christianity's Origins as a Flavian Secrecy Cult digs even further into the book of Luke and looks for parallels between the book of Luke and Josephus. And he hit pay dirt. He found over 250 separate parallels, or with some of them have many separate motifs within them. 250 separate parallels just in the book of Luke. Luke itself only has 1,151 verses, so that means that some of the parallels last for several verses. It basically means that the book of Luke is absolutely saturated with parallels to War of the Jews. Some of the parallels are breathtaking in their detail, intricateness, and being incredibly well hidden, that you can read over it and not even see it until you actually analyze it. And then some of them are relatively trivial and offhand comments that could be interpreted as random if they just stood alone, or if there were just 5 of them in the whole book of Luke or something. But there are hundreds of them. And so it's pretty clear that probably most, if not all, of the ones that Menescotts found are legit. There are about a dozen of them that are brilliant in their evil, deceptive intentions. And then there are quite a few other ones that are very solid parallels with many separate motifs. So not only that, but then Menescotts graphed the book of Luke onto a chart. Put the book of Luke on the vertical axis, Josephus on the horizontal axis. Puts a dot at every location where there is a parallel, and constructs 5 near-perfect letters in Latin, the language of the Roman Caesars, APTVS. TVS would be Titus Vespasian. The AP, not sure. Could be Arius Piso, who was an underling, kind of from one of the powerful Roman families, who was a close relative of the Flavians, or possibly Aegion Pneuma, which means Holy Spirit. So that would be the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. That could be Domitian, the younger brother. Regardless, the main point is that the Romans not only wrote the book of Luke, but they autographed it. And they're waiting thousands of years for you to figure it out. In the meantime, while you don't figure it out, you are being mocked and ridiculed by all of the inside jokes that the Romans are playing on you if you don't understand the code and how these parallels are put together. Many of the parallels are extremely mean-spirited and tinged with hate. And many of them go beyond that to outright pornography, gay pedophilia, and cannibalism. So you have been warned, and if you don't look at the book of Josephus, you will continue to be mocked by the New Testament. Not by me, by the New Testament. But you have to read Josephus to figure that out. And since you've been citing him nonstop for the last 20 years as the verification that Jesus really did exist, perhaps you should read it. Okay, now what we're doing today is we're looking at, this is, I believe, the 6th episode of The Case for Christ as the Case for Caesar. The Case for Christ was a book that started a genre of the case for something important about Jesus' life, but written by the court reporter Lee Strobel, who traveled across the country and interviewed about a dozen different biblical experts, apologists, and built up a legal case for the existence of Christ. And this is the book that you will be given if you have Christian friends and they are trying to convert you. They will give you this book. The irony of the whole situation is that they are utterly ignorant of the Roman origins hypothesis, or feigned ignorance of it, and the points that they make actually make the case for Caesar better than they make the case for Christ. Okay, so here we have papyri expert Jose O'Callahan said one Dead Sea fragment from the Dead Sea Scrolls is part of the earliest manuscript ever found of the Gospel of Mark, dating back to a mere 17 to 20 years after Jesus was crucified. Now, what he's not telling you is that this early manuscript of Mark that they're speaking of. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls are all written in Hebrew, very few of them in Greek, Hebrew and Aramaic, and they are all Old Testament material along with a lot of sectarian material, particular to the sect that lived there at Qumran. Now, question is whether they lived in the 2nd century BC, 1st century BC, or 1st century AD. But, you know, a lot of people increasingly are believing it was in the 1st century AD. So these manuscripts may have a lot to do with the source material that the Romans used for writing the New Testament, because the Herods would have known how to read the Hebrew stuff. But they say that there was a manuscript of Mark that was found among the Dead Sea fragments. But when they say fragment, they are that is an understatement. I believe that this fragment is smaller than a credit card and does not contain a single full word. It contains a bunch of fragments of words. And so that is, I just think it's dishonest. I mean, that doesn't mean necessarily that it's not the Gospel of Mark dating back to a mere 17 to 20 years after Jesus was crucified, but you could have mentioned that that fragment was really, really, really fragmentary. So, however, many scholars continue to be skeptical of his interpretation. Instead of saying directly yes or no, Jesus replied, "Go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cured, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is preached to the poor." Now, but this is from Matthew 11:4. Jesus' response was an allusion to Isaiah 61, which, according to Abelard Reuchlin and Roman Piso, Isaiah 61 was written by the Romans. The Romans went back into the Old Testament and added several other verses in order to historicize the story that they had. And they may have forced the Jews at Japhne, the ones that were there that created rabbinical Judaism under the auspices of the Flavians as well, showing that the Flavians had an MO of creating religions for propaganda purposes, not just with Christianity, but also rabbinical Judaism, among other religions. But for some reason, Jesus included the phrase, "the dead are raised," which is conspicuously absent from the Old Testament text. This is where the Qumran section comes in. This non-biblical manuscript from the Dead Sea collection, written in Hebrew, dates back to 30 years before Jesus was born. It contains a version of Isaiah 61 that does include this missing phrase, "the dead are raised." Well, that's pretty interesting. If that's written in Hebrew, that would give credence to this Isaiah 61. And including the phrase "the dead are raised." Now, again, I guess it would have done that anyway if the Jews at Japhna were forced to put that down. Now, the Jews at Japhna were much less zealous than the ones that were executed that created the revolt. These were the Pharisaic Jews who were much more peace-loving and much more interested in, breaking down the scriptures, as opposed to, a zealot would have rather died than changed the Bible because Caesar told them, but maybe not a Pharisee. Okay, "the dead are raised." Scroll scholar Craig Evans has pointed out that this phrase in this particular Qumran manuscript is unquestionably embedded in a messianic context. McRae said, "It refers to the wonders that the Messiah will do when he comes and when heaven and earth will obey him." So when Jesus gave his response to John, he was not being ambiguous at all. John would have instantly recognized his words as a distinct claim that Jesus was the Messiah. Not quite clear on that. John would have instantly recognized his words as a distinct claim that Jesus was the Messiah. So that phrase, "the dead are raised," is unquestionably embedded. Okay, so they use this term, "the dead are raised." Now, according to Roman Piso, The dead are raised actually refers to, on a much more dirty level, it refers to getting an erection. And that is all part of the code that you have to understand to recognize the pornography that's written in the New Testament. Another hint is that every time that they use the term eyes, they mean anuses. And many of these the Romans who wrote this were among the most depraved, debauched people who have ever lived. Almost all of them were, all of the rich ones had sodomite slaves. They had sex slaves that did nothing but had to bend over for them. And they referred to their sodomized slaves as eyes, because that is the only thing that about them that function is the only reason that they existed for these Roman emperors and so on. And so they refer to their sodomite slaves as their eyes or their anuses, because that's all they were to them. So that is an alternate interpretation of that verse there. The dead are raised. But, this author is saying this is unquestionably embedded in a messianic context. Well, it might be embedded in a messianic context, but I wouldn't say that would be unquestionably, simply because of Isaiah 61 referring to it. Okay, next chapter. Everyone would agree that you don't appeal to supernatural causes if you don't have to. And that's where the Roman origins hypothesis comes in. Many times these apologists will say, well, since there's not a good explanation, that means that God did it. That means that, God did the virgin birth, and God did the resurrection. But when you recognize that the whole thing was written by the Romans and it's entirely fiction, then you don't need any of those type of explanations. Since they've never seen the supernatural, they assume miracles have never occurred in history. Here's what they do. They rule out the possibility of the supernatural from the beginning. Well, I'm certainly not doing that. I'm just saying you don't resort to the supernatural unless there's a need to. Historians usually operate with the burden of proof on the historian to prove the falsity or unreliability, since people are generally not compulsive liars. Unfortunately, that isn't... so the next sentence is, without that assumption, we'd know very little about ancient history. And so the red pill for this guy right here is that unfortunately is the case. The people that wrote your history and the people that wrote your mythology or your religion were compulsive liars. They were the Romans. The Romans had a monopoly on censorship, they had a monopoly on publishing, and they had a monopoly on distribution. Nobody was reading anything in the first century if it wasn't under the auspices of the Romans. And they wrote, historians today ancient historians are utterly dependent on Josephus for telling them what happened, especially in ancient Rome and in ancient Israel, Palestine. But he is not to be believed, and he's totally unreliable, because all of it is about creating parallels between the Gospels and Josephus. And so he probably is telling you approximately what happened in this war between the Jews and the Romans, But with details, he's not telling you the truth at all. He's trying to get a parallel form with the New Testament that he's also writing as well. And so this burden of proof, historians usually operate with the burden of proof on the historian to prove the falsity or unreliability, since people are generally not compulsive liars. Well, that is going to have to be re-examined if that is what historians do. Because, or he's talking about ancient historians. The mere fact that somebody wrote something, people are generally not compulsive liars. That's just like so naive. There's no such thing as propaganda. There's no such thing as psychological operations. There's no such thing as secret government agencies. There's no such thing as advertising. This is exactly what is our problem, is that we're trusting this Bible as like the Word of God, or like by the word of some honest broker who's trying to tell you a story. But in reality, this is coming to you directly from the worst people that have ever lived on the planet. Or maybe not the very worst, but right down there with them. Okay, now he says, we have 4 Gospels corroborated with Paul that can be cross-checked to some degree with non-biblical authors like Josephus and others. And now he talks about a number of others, Apollonius of Diana, Philostratus. These are the same people. This is the same story. But Apollonius has pretty much the same story as Jesus does, but he's dated from a couple centuries later. So he's an easy straw man for this author to put out there, because, Apollonius was most likely drawn from the story of Jesus, not the other way around. So he says the writers of the gospel had nothing to gain and much to lose by writing Jesus' story. And they didn't have ulterior motives such as financial gain, unless it was written by the Romans. The Gospels have a very confident eyewitness perspective, as if they had a camera there. That's, I can't remember the name of that construction, but that is some type of narrative form for people who are writing fiction. When you it's really omniscience. It's written as omniscient because you are omniscient, because you're the fiction writer. You are creating the whole story, and so you know exactly